In this lecture, I want to examine some of the objections raised against deontology. But before doing that, I want to discuss some ideas or principles that have been closely associated with the deontologist's framework. These are the value of autonomy and the moral claim that you should never treat people merely as a means. Understanding these ideas requires us to go more deeply into some subtle philosophical theories. This lecture will therefore be more difficult than the others, and you should expect to be puzzled at certain points and want to ask questions, so please do so. The point of this lecture is to begin to give you some understanding of these ethical concepts. You cannot simply assert, respect autonomy, without having some idea of what autonomy is and why it should be respected. Remember, the objective is not to dogmatically declare what is ethical, but to be able to explain and justify your ethical decisions in public. You should also be aware that there is a great deal of controversy over the interpretation of these principles and theories. I will be presenting what I believe are the most accessible interpretations, especially to people who do not have a background in the history of philosophy. The objective is to enable you to engage or challenge these ideas if you wish. Indeed, if you are interested in exploring any of these ideas further or wish to examine other interpretations, please contact me. I would be delighted to suggest further reading. Let's consider the claim. Never use people merely as a means, but always at the same time as an end. We begin with the idea that what distinguishes people from mere objects or other animals is that people are rational beings. What this means is not that people are good at reasoning or are always logical. They hardly are that. It means that people, as rational beings, can act on the basis of reasons, and not simply on the basis of appetite or instinct. An automobile's behavior is based entirely on the laws of physics that describe the workings of the engine, the brakes, the steering mechanism, and so forth. An animal's behavior is based entirely on its appetites and instincts, which the scientific laws of biology try to capture. But in contrast to these two, a rational being's behavior can be based on a reason that it sets for itself. For example, a person could say, I want to eat that piece of cake, but I won't because I am on a diet. That is to say, this person's behavior is characterized by a reason that he has given himself. I am on a diet. A reason that in this case is opposed to an appetite he happens to have. Whereas the automobile and the animal are governed by laws of nature, the person can be governed by laws or principles he has given himself. Acknowledging something as a person, as a rational being, means acknowledging that it has the capacity to act on the basis of reasons. Let's turn to the idea of using people. Suppose, for example, you wanted to look over a wall. You have the choice of climbing on a rock or climbing on a person. In either case, you are using something as a means to look over the wall. You're using the rock as a means to look over the wall, or you're using the person as a means to look over the wall. In the case of the rock, you're using it simply or merely as a means. You need have no other attitude toward the rock. The case of using the person is different because, so the moral claim goes, your use of that person must be consistent with your acknowledgement that the person is a rational being. In other words, your use of that person must be consistent with the idea that that person's behavior is governed by reasons that he gives himself. This can be achieved by persuading the person to agree to have you climb on top of him, by giving that person reasons that he accepts which allow you to climb on top of him. If you do not acknowledge him as a rational being, then you're using him as you would use a rock, merely as a means. But if you do acknowledge him as a rational being so that your use of him is subject to his having reasons to cooperate, subject to his rationally consenting to your using him, then you are using him as a means to look over the wall, but you're not using him merely or simply as a means. You are not using him as you would a rock. Sometimes the claim that you should not treat people merely as means is supplemented with the claim that you should treat people as ends or ends in themselves. What is this extra claim? It stems from the idea that acknowledging people as rational beings is not simply recognizing some fact about people, it is to recognize a value. To acknowledge that people have the capacity to act on reasons they give themselves is to acknowledge that people have dignity and value. A rock or an automobile can of course have value, but its value arises from its use. A rock might have value as a projectile or as a platform on which to climb. The value a rational being has does not arise from any use. The value is unconditional in itself. In other words, to acknowledge the dignity and value of rational beings is to acknowledge that they cannot be treated as mere instruments. They must be treated, to use the technical term, as ends in themselves. To summarize, the claim that people should never be treated as mere means, but always at the same time as ends in themselves, means that 1. People can be used only subject to their rational acceptance, and 2. People must be treated as having dignity and unconditional value. I should repeat that what I have just said is not the only explanation that has been given of this famous claim, but I believe it is one of the more accessible and plausible interpretations. That said, there are many questions and objections you might raise against the idea of never treating people merely as a means. I encourage you to raise them in the discussion forum. Let's turn to the concept of autonomy. On some understandings of that concept, to be autonomous is to be free of all influences. An autonomous action would be one that is not influenced by external factors, such as what other people might say or do. This is not how autonomy is understood in deontology. This is an important point to be clear about. In many discussions in professional ethics, especially in bioethics, autonomy is understood to mean being free of external influence. A person making an autonomous choice is one who chooses according to that person's preferences and no one else's. And respecting someone's autonomy means deferring to their preferences. Taken literally, this understanding of autonomy is impossible. It applies to no one. No one is completely independent or uninfluenced by what other people say and do. But, to be clear, that is not what this interpretation of autonomy is about. This understanding of autonomy is grounded in a concern over paternalism, so that respecting autonomy amounts to rejecting paternalism. We will discuss paternalism more fully in a different lesson, so for now I will note that the deontologist employs a more sophisticated conception of autonomy. As we'll see shortly, for the deontologist, respecting a person's autonomy is not a matter of deferring to that person's preferences. So what is autonomy according to the deontologist? Autonomy, according to the deontologist, refers to the capacity to be self-governing. As we noted just a little while ago, according to the deontologist, people as rational beings can act on the basis of reasons that they set for themselves. When they act in this way, they are acting autonomously because they are self-governing. To influence a person by reasoning with him is to acknowledge his autonomy. If instead we influence a person by force, manipulation, or deception, we are not regarding that person as autonomous. Indeed, we are treating that person as an object or as an animal, as something that is subject to physical laws, instincts, and appetites, but nothing more. Respecting autonomy means acknowledging that that person's decisions and actions, his will, is susceptible to reasons. It therefore begins with acknowledging that the person's preferences are reasonable. Being reasonable, of course, does not mean that the preferences are absolute or immutable. Influencing, even challenging a person's preferences with reasoned argument is perfectly in line with respecting that person's autonomy. Furthermore, the person's preferences have weight. How much weight will depend upon the context. When it comes to whether that person should undergo some medical procedure, that person's autonomous preferences have decisive weight. We should begin to see why many deontologists therefore place such a high value on autonomy. It reflects what distinguishes people from mere animals. Acknowledging an individual's autonomy is tantamount to acknowledging that individual's humanity, that individual is a person. And you should be able to begin to see the connection between respecting autonomy and not using people merely as a means. If you're using someone merely as a means, you are not respecting that person's autonomy.